All right. Good afternoon, everyone. We are very well aware that we are between you and the end of the day. So we're hoping to leave the conference on a bit of a inspired note, but maybe a little bit of a spicy conversation. Thank you all for being here. My name is Tanya Rumble. I'm the Executive Director of Development in the Faculty of Arts at Toronto Metropolitan University, where I have the pleasure of working with John Beebe and the folks at the Democratic Engagement Exchange. And in thinking about the conference and the sessions and content around democracy, we felt it was going to be important to also think about bringing in the conversation around philanthropy and the role of philanthropy and government support for democracy. So I want to first start by also introducing my fellow panelists. So on my very, very left, we have Alan Northcott, who is the president of the Max Bell Foundation. Prior to joining Max Bell in 1998, Alan was a member of the academic staff at the University of Illinois and the University of Calgary, and was a member of the research staff at the Canada West Foundation. He served as an advisor and on the boards of a number of not for profit organizations, and he currently serves as a member of the board of directors for Imagine Canada, Philanthropic Foundations of Canada, the Pemsel Case Foundation as well, and he's also in the editorial board for The Philanthropist. So, welcome, Alan. Thank you so much for being here. Directly on my left is Ikem Opara, who's the Director of National Learning Partnerships with the Rideau Hall Foundation. Ikem is where he leads the design and delivery of the organization's commitment to advancing access to learning opportunities for all across Canada. He has spent the last 20 years engaging public and private sector partners in Canada, Tanzania, Kenya, and Cuba to build relationships and strengthen connections across national, linguistic, cultural, and other borders. Following roles at Pathways to Education, Canada World Youth, and Canadian Jesuits International over the years, ECAM subsequently led OTF, or the Ontario Trillium Foundation, the largest grant maker in the province, their strategy, grant making, and capacity building work with a focus on inclusion and improved outcomes for Black and Indigenous youth. So welcome, ECAM. Thank you for being here. And then finally, last but certainly not least, and in the middle, is Mohammed Hashim. Mohammed has worked as a labor organizer and a human rights advocate for over a decade. He's dedicated his career to supporting equity, inclusion, and community empowerment. He's currently the executive director of the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, a member of the board of trustees of the United Way of Greater Toronto, largest United Way in the world. Mr. Hashim is also the founding advisor of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network. Welcome, Mohammed. So preparing for today's session, I did a little bit of Googling, which is, I know, don't judge me, scholars in the room, but it is a very good way to get some cursory information about philanthropy and democracy. And when I Googled the term philanthropy, democracy in Canada, I came up with not too much, frankly. When I went down the rabbit hole a little further and I searched for charitable organizations that had the term democracy in the name of their organization, out of the 96,000 charities in Canada, there were nine. Nine. And when I further looked into each of those, was one of those that had a focus on grant making or giving out their resources in the space of democracy. So that was frankly a bit of a bleak picture for me. But I'm hoping that Alan, Ikem, and Mohammed can offer a brighter picture of the role of philanthropy in democracy and supporting democratic innovation, civic engagement, and the building of social capital. So maybe I'll ask our panelists to first start by reflecting on what exactly is your perception of the health status of our democracy? And what symptoms might you point to give you that rating in support of your assessment? So maybe I'll start with Alan on the left.
Hello. Thank you, Tanya. And thanks for the invitation to be here. It's a pleasure and humbling to be in this room and on this panel. I'm an enthusiastic amateur in this space, and we've heard in the last couple of days from experts on this, but I'll give you my answer nonetheless. So how's the health of Canada's democracy? Good, I think, but at risk. And why do I say that? So if we think of trust as, or skeptical trust, taking Pippa's cautions on board, as the lifeblood of democracy, I think Canada has done really well. And I would look to what happened in this country during the pandemic as an indication of that. So compared to G7 and G10 countries, we had lower mortality per capita. We had very high vaccine uptake. And the people who know about these things have said that's not necessarily because our institutions were so great. It's primarily because of the social bonds between Canadians, between the trust that Canadians have in each other and in their institutions. So that's a very positive. And I think we've heard in the last couple of days a lot of reasons why we should believe that trust and therefore our relationship with democratic institutions is good. But, and here's the at-risk part, as the pandemic wore on, I think it would be fair to say that trust began to fray. The divisions between the factions that emerged during the pandemic around a number of issues are with us today, I think, and are still having ripple effects on our public and political discourse. And then, of course, there's the Edelman Trust Barometer, the one that's easiest to find when you use Google, right? 2023, the results for Canada are that Canadians don't trust, but are rather neutral in terms of our government, in terms of nonprofits, in terms of the media, and in terms of business. The only institution that Canadians trust, by and large, according to this measure, is their own employer. Okay, some giggles there. Yeah, that's a visceral reaction. And then there's this question about polarization, I think, is feeding into it. A lot of academics have said that we're not really as divided as our discourse about polarization would have us believe. And we heard yesterday from Alison Earl, who used the term affective polarization. Really resonates for me, what I've been seeing and reading. But nevertheless, and going back to the Edelman report, 60% of Canadians were more divided now than we have been in the past. So at risk. Why? Let me speculate. I'll have 2 points to speculate about why. So during COVID, there was a K-shaped trajectory, I think, in terms of people's living standards. People like me had secure jobs, could work from home, and discretionary spending opportunities were closed. So it actually, from an economic point of view, wasn't all that bad. But there were lots and lots of people who were precariously employed, who lost their job, or who were required to turn up in person and put their health at risk and put at risk the health of their families. They had a downward slope during the pandemic. And the other thing we saw, of course, is that leg of trajectory had pretty profound intersections with race, and with ethnicity, and with gender at various points during the pandemic too. And now, we have high inflation and increased costs of borrowing, which is just kind of amplifying that effect. So that's one. Two, I think in the terms of the political discourse, now the seeds of polarization were in place before the pandemic, but as the pandemic wore on, we saw in different parts of the country, different political leaders began to capitalize, I think, on the social and cultural divisions that emerged around the friction between public health restrictions on the one hand and the social and economic and mental health effects that isolation was having. And that got amplified again during the vaccine rollout. And I think that's problematic. That worries me probably more than anything when politicians are willing to, for political gain, amplify frictions that are related to our social contract. I think we're in a risky spot.
Thanks, Alan. Mohammed, how about you? Health of the democracy, how might you rate it? What gives you that assessment?
Before I start, I just want to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you today from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Huron-Wendat, the Chippewas, and the Ojibwe people, and most recently Mississaugas, the Credit First Nation, and covered under Treaty 13 land. I also, because there's survivors of the Japanese Canadian redress the Japanese internment in this room today. So I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which is where I work, is created because of the pain Japanese Canadians had endured during World War II and the internment. And when the Japanese community created a settlement with the federal government, they asked for an individual compensation, which was to survivors, and a community compensation in the form of an endowment and the creation of our organization, the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, to fight racism in perpetuity. So I'm here not only because of the legacy of that wrong, but because of the strength of the survivors that have fought for a better Canada in perpetuity. So I just want to recognize those who are in the room who would know, who are connected to that history. I also wanted to say I'm the president and founder of the Erica Eiffel fan club. So missed that as part of my bio. Um, where's my so there, I have very mixed feelings about this because I travel the country a lot and I speak to racialized communities, indigenous communities all the time. And so there's two things I want to say. It's like one is, and just before this, I parked under City Hall just before this, and I went up to the second floor where all the city council offices are, and I ran into three of my friends who are city councilors, and it reminded me that you know every month when city council meets, which is I think the last Thursday of the month, or Tuesday of the month, sorry, schedule changed or not. But at the beginning of the meeting, the chair says, would anyone like to have any items to hold? So then people say, yeah, 17.4, 17.4, 18.6. And then, so all these different items get held back. And then the chair says, can I get a motion to approve everything else omnibus? And then somebody says, yeah, and the other person just ignores it. And then like the omnibus motion passes. The omnibus motion has 99.9% of all decisions of the city council. It's like maybe 0.1% of the decisions that are going to be contested are brought to the floor for discussion. So what that tells me is that even in a very polarized environment like Toronto City Council, you can still see faith that you will have unanimous consent over a vast majority of issues, and that there are going to be issues that are going to be contentious, that are going to be discussed, and that are going to have more fulsome discussion. Some of them civil, some of them not. But a lot of the stuff of what we assume happens typically without a lot of brouhaha, I'd say. But I also want to say that, when I was talking to one of my colleagues from, one of the federal agencies dealing with elections, she had mentioned something that sat with me last night, which was about 20% of Indigenous communities, voter participation in some Indigenous communities is about 20% lower than the regular population. And I thought about that, and I was like, why do some people check out from voting? And part of that is because people who vote because they think that their vote will matter. And if they don't think that their vote's going to matter, they're probably not going to vote. And what I'm feeling right now amongst a lot of racialized communities that I work with is that there's a huge amount of, after George Floyd, for example, people felt like, wow, things are going to change. There was hope. People thought there's corporations that are hopping on board. Prime ministers are taking knees. Things are going to move. And 2 years down the line, it's feeling like sour grapes where things haven't moved, or they haven't moved far enough, and that my sense is that that sense of disappointment is going to have an effect on democracy. And I can't say that. So on the good side, a lot of things get passed and within a non-contentious environment. And on the other end, my sense is that it's going in the wrong direction because a lot of more people are feeling disconnected to voting actually mattering. So in the middle-ish somewhere.
Okay, also kind of a good/neutral response there. Ikem, health of our democracy.
With that, this up. All right. I think that the health of our democracy, your perspective on it depends on what you understand democracy to be and the purpose of it. I think in this part of the world, so for context, I was born and raised in southeastern Nigeria, which is a democratic country. Nobody laughed. And then since then, I have lived in 3 other countries for varying periods of time: Canada, Cuba, and Tanzania, all of which to some extent are democratic countries or practice democracy as a process of electing people into office to some extent. But I will challenge anyone to draw through lines in the democratic behavior of Nigerian society, Tanzanian society, Canadian society, and Cuban society. They're all democracies, whether in name or practice or in political classification. I also had the misfortune of studying political science, and one of the things, I was supposed to be a commerce student. See, this happens. And after making a severe left turn away from commerce and deciding to study political science, my father, in his disappointment, said, who's going to vote for you as a Nigerian in Canada? Why would you study political science? So I'm not doing this because I want to run for office. I'm doing this because I find people endlessly fascinating, and this thing that we do called democracy and the political behavior that takes place in community. So that's one piece of the context. The other that shapes my understanding of democracy and this question is also my journey to being here. I used to work, as Tanya mentioned, at Pathways to Education, and I had a colleague when I was there. I was an international student when I came here and went through the process of becoming a Canadian citizen. It was like a Wednesday afternoon at 11:30 when I went to do my citizenship ceremony in somewhere downtown. And I got back to work, and my colleague, one of my colleagues, asked me, it was like, isn't it amazing? Like this, like you just became a Canadian citizen. I was like, Dinny, I have a meeting at 11 o'clock. This was not a highlight of my day. I have a meeting. For me, that was an administrative exercise. It was an administrative experience because to some extent, that there had been a period of time when that category of being a Canadian had been reduced to a classification. So citizenship, the way I saw it was, I am a Nigerian. I have a Canadian citizenship. I am not a Canadian. That changed over a period of time. What changed and the things that changed that sentiment within me, I think that's at the core of what answers your question about the health of democracy. The things that happen in community that make me want to care about the community that I live in, the people that are in it, what laws and policies are enacted or not, how we govern, fund, and extract resources from our community to do what we all want to do. That for me is the measure of whether a democracy is healthy or not necessarily voter turnout. Voter turnout is an excellent proxy for one behavior in democracy, which is electing officials. But when we start to have the conversations about caring for your neighbors, connecting to people that you don't know because they exist, and how we recognize and value the humanity in others and connecting along lines of commonality, to me, that's when democracy, which is our most obvious group hug, becomes a thing that is healthy and a thing that is living and vibrant. I had I'm quite fortunate right now. I have a rental car. My car got backed into a while ago, so it's in the shop. And the rental that I was given is a Jeep. It's a Jeep Wrangler. Does anyone here drive a Jeep? Okay. Okay. When I say the Jeep wave, do you know what I mean? Okay. So this is a phenomenon that I just discovered in the last couple of weeks. I live in Pickering, it's in Durham region. I'm new to there. We moved there during the pandemic. I know some of my neighbors, they're quite friendly and, we see each other all the time. And I drive a lot. I've got young children and we go around a lot. Driving a Jeep for the last 3 weeks has meant that I have entered this weird club where every other person who drives a Wrangler waves to me. This is the thing that is established and accepted among Jeep drivers. There's a hierarchy to it. There's a way you do it. There's YouTube videos about doing it and not doing it. But for some reason, I am the same Black man who's been driving around for the last 3 years. But now, a whole bunch of strangers just wave. And I wave back, and my kids are in it. Like, we're trying to figure, now there's something that has happened that if I were to drive past one of those drivers in distress, I'm now more likely to pull over and figure out, hey, are you okay? Do you need a tow? Do you need an extra? You know what I mean? So something has changed. I happened to be driving a Jeep. So when you ask the question of the health of our democracy, I think the health of our democracy is good. I think the things that make me answer that question, that it's good, are very different from things like the Edelman Trust Barometer and voter participation. I think is the more intangible things about how we connect to one another as humans.
Oh, there's a lot there that we can certainly unpack, and I want to be part of this Jeep Wrangler Club. When you were speaking, Ekem, I was thinking a lot about this idea of caremongering, and it became like this term that was codified during the pandemic that originated in Canada as to how people were helping and supporting their community members when we were in lockdown. And so, if we're all sort of on the same page that the health of our democracy is good, then should our focus when it comes to funding initiatives that are intended to bolster our democracy, should they be focused on being curative? Because we've all pointed out some areas where we have opportunities for improvement, and certainly throughout the course of the last 2 days, we've talked about those things. Should it be palliative, where we are focusing on sort of easing the pain but not curing the ills? Or should it be health promotion and sort of prophylactic? Or should it be preventative? I threw that one in there. You didn't prepare for that question. Yeah, pass it on.
Okay. I at the risk of sounding quite non-committal, I think it has to be all of those things. And it has to be all of those things all at once. I think, however, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. So we don't have to we can divide who does those things and who intervenes in different aspects. I think the needs of communities are different depending on where they are in their proximity to democratic institutions and the experience of government. As if you are a newcomer to a particular community, your relationship with your city hall and MPs might be very different from someone who has lived there for generations. I have a neighbor who, I don't actually know if this is true or not, but one morning I'm walking my dog and another neighbor told me that, you see the house down the street, when our neighborhood was farmland, they owned that land. That house, that family owned that land. And at some point, they sold the land to the city to develop our neighborhood. And the names of our streets are the names of their friends, right? So I can imagine that my experience and my relationship with Pickering City Hall is very different from the experience of that family. I don't know that one is better than the other, but I think that I might need a bit more of a curative intervention as I'm getting more involved in the democratic process in my city, in my community. And that family might not, for many different reasons.
Alan, thought?
So, I mean, we're in a very interesting position because so we work on federal policy regularly. So we're not a typical funder in terms of being a philanthropist where we have like our philanthropy dictates what our board of directors dictate to a certain degree, but we also work within a governmental context and we want to be able to see how legislation is changing, where we also have access to legislation before it becomes legislation. So we're very much intertwined into the system of things. So like our funding branch, so we have, you know, a public policy like department that works directly with the government on, you know, we're right now working on Canada's action plan to combat hate, Canada's anti-racism strategy. There's a modernizing employment equity that's happening. These are all big, huge federal initiatives that we're playing like a direct role into. So we recognize that, you know, our job as an organization is to be able to feed into that. But our funding branch is a recognition that none of what we do happens without there being, I don't know a better way to put it, but fire in the air. Like, you know, when like racism, to be frank, does not move because people feel inherently bad about things. You know, racism, like public policy on racism moves because there is a demand from civil society, and that demand is hot enough that necessitates a response from government. And that response comes slowly and over time. But the ecosystem doesn't move just because we're putting forward our public policy department and helping shape the policy. The ecosystem moves because there's fire in the air on the other side as well. So we recognize that there's a huge amount of actors, and some of the actors that we fund don't even like us because because like our role is quite institutional. But we do that because we want to make sure that the ecosystem around how racism and hate are tackled in this country happens with the recognition that all these different actors play a critical role into it. So in terms of the scale of, you know, where do we invest in, we probably invest more on, you know, right now currently we probably invest well 50-50 on creating fire in the air and then creating solutions. I think going forward, because there is significant amount of fire in the air consistently these days, it feels like we might pivot and create more opportunity for public policy approaches on dealing with racism. So, and I'll give some examples later on, but I think that for us as an organization, we have a new strat plan that says, you know, be a catalyst for public policy change. And we're going to use our funding branch to catalyze that environment.
Thank you. Alan, maybe I'll slightly pivot a little bit, but I'm hoping that you can give a kind of counterpoint to that. So if we all agree that the health of our democracy is relatively good, and maybe there isn't, you know, it's not burning, it's not completely ill, it's not, you know, not savable. Who do you think is really responsible then for funding an engaged populace and the building of social capital? Who takes that on?
Well, so I have a couple of answers, but in my bones, the answer is all of us, right? I mean, if you like democracy, if you value democracy, if you participate in a liberal democracy, it's on you, it's on me, it's on all of us, I think, to do what we can. And, you know, it's not a functioning liberal democracy when there are segments of the population who can't participate, who face barriers to participation. That's our responsibility too, I think, to do what we can to ensure that our neighbors, Ikem, are struck by what you said, that the other Jeep drivers or the people that you see on the street, right? I'm not going to sit here and moralize, but we have an obligation to each other to ensure that we're all able to participate in that democracy. There's maybe some more concrete answers to this. I think one of the things we want governments to do is to protect our democratic institutions, right? And so I think part of that involves looking ahead, like curative, to come back to your earlier question, to fix the things that aren't functioning now, but to look ahead at what the risks are on the horizon. And there are, I think, a few, not least of which in the information environment and now with the emergence of generative AI, we've got some risks out there that I think we need to think carefully about in terms of what they mean for our democratic institutions. But I would also say foundations like the one that employs me have an obligation, right? So, foundations are registered charities. Part of achieving that registration, part of the obligation of maintaining it is that the work you do is for the public benefit. And I think a pretty good argument can be made that protecting and preserving democratic institutions is down near the bedrock of public benefit.
Thank you. Ekem, what do you think that we can gain if we fund initiatives with a lot of flexibility? Because often this work is messy. Like we've talked a lot about this work, and so if we're talking about getting people specifically out to vote, although I think that work can be messy too. Or we want to fund the work of advocacy, where again the public policy outcomes may not be well understood, or there's a lot of collective action that's going to be required to achieve a particular outcome. What do you think we can gain by starting to fund some of this work?
I, I think it staves off the risk that I see. I mean, we've kind of agreed that our democracy and democratic behavior is healthy, is good. But I think it is not going to be for a long time longer if we don't do more. I think what has allowed it to remain in this state of being good is that we are a relatively wealthy country. We are a relatively politically stable and safe country. We don't have any natural predators when it comes to like our political environment, our economy, and things like that. When you think about it in that way, and we're also we've also gone through a long time of Canada's evolution where we've been able to ignore or sweep a lot of our own evils under the rug, and that has allowed us to live in this state where everything is okay. But that's changing as our demographics continue to change, as our neighborhoods continue to look a lot more like this room than like it did when 100 years ago, when someone would have been having this conversation in this room. Those are all things that change the needs of. I was on in a session on technology yesterday, and someone mentioned that one of the biggest changes that they're seeing is that the demands that customers have of their providers is changing radically. The demands that we as citizens have now of our society and our democracy and our government and of each other is changing dramatically as we all change and become more of an inclusive and global society. So I think what we gain by funding those things that can push our understanding and push at advocacy is that you strengthen the muscle for people to interrogate democratic institutions and not see that as looking to cut them down or get rid of them. It's a part of strengthening what works. I belong to a historically Black men's fraternity where one of our signature national programs is called The Voteless People is a Hopeless People. It centers the voting behavior as an important practice, but we don't tell you who to vote or what policies or directions or parties are best for you. It's recognizing that that activity is important. And for you to recognize that that activity is important, there's a whole bunch of things that probably need to happen in your life and in your community that leads you to the point where you're not just choosing randomly from a list of 120 potential candidates, including a dog.
So to Ekam's point, they're encouraging voting behavior, but not telling you who to vote for. It's hard to talk about democracy if we don't talk about politics. But Mohammed, in the position that you're sitting in at the Canadian Race Relations Foundation, which was created, as you said, around for Japanese Canadians as part of a community settlement, how do you navigate this idea of, is it necessary to be agnostic? Can you be agnostic in your funding of this work when it comes to supporting advocacy, democracy, civic engagement, building social capital? Is that possible?
Well, it's a tricky one for us because I mean we're a public institution, so we do fund groups who do advocacy. We, but like, if we gave money to do a survey to somebody, you can weaponize the survey. And then you can do advocacy around it. So I don't think that like, any, like none of our funding is going, I mean, well, particularly our future funding is not going to be going towards, you know, I mean, there's a variety of different places, but our first year of when we did our call, we kind of said, tell us how you think anti-racism works and how can you improve the anti-racism environment. So we got like, of the 600 applications we got the first time, which was very painful to go through. I'd say 300 of them were based on art. Another 100 of them were based on sports. And then maybe 50 of them were based on research and a mix of everything else. Part of what we took that research back and we actually evaluated where our applications were. And we took the art-based applications and we were very annoyed that we got art-based applications. Don't tell the people who applied to us about that. But we thought that the Canada Council for the Arts should be funding that. They got $500 million to give out. So why are we giving out? Like, why are we being asked for this money? So we went and got a privacy exemption from our applicants, and we sent the entire package of all the applications, and we sent to the Canada Council and said, please deal with this because your pockets are deeper. We took the funding ones and we sent it to Sports Canada because we think they should deal with it. Like the system right now in terms of like how anti-racism funding is working is that I would say like on advocacy work, it's a lot of individuals who are doing it. Some organizations are doing it and doing it well, but those are very far and few between because the like advocacy and democratic engagement costs a lot of money. Like I used to work for labor. My job was a political organizer for labor. So we used to spend millions of dollars every election to get our members to go vote. So I know what the cost of democratic engagement looks like. And there's no way anybody is putting that kind of money into like the general population or organizations that are mobilizing certain communities. So like, can we be agnostic? I don't think there is anything as being agnostic as a funder. We can't even say that being agnostic as a funder is an option because like all our decisions are going to be measured in terms of what we're like if we're funding this, what will the outcome look like? And if the outcome is going to look like it's going to drive change, which is what the only thing we care about is driving change, then it'll never be agnostic.
So I think to that end, thank you, Mohammed. Max Bell Foundation is decidedly not agnostic in terms of the outcome it's seeking with the funding that it provides. And so, Alan, can you tell us a little bit about why the foundation is so doggedly focused on public policy? I added doggedly in there.
Been described as a lot of things, Tanya, but doggedly. So why public policy? Well, I mean, at a gross level, it's leverage, right? I mean, governments are far and away the biggest spenders when it comes to supporting activities in civil society. So, when you're a tiny little foundation, and I think my job to kind of sum it up is to get the most positive bang for the buck, right? And so if we can shape or inform what governments are doing, how governments spend money, that's big bang for the buck. It goes a bit deeper than that. I mean, it's not just the funding, it's the shaping effect that public policy has. Think about things ranging from what's in the school curriculum or carbon pricing or the registered disability savings plan or changes to the immigration system, right? All of these things, and the list goes on and on and on and on. To the extent we can make those better for Canadians, we're having an enormously positive effect. So, alongside the leverage is this interest in the quality of public policy. So I would say our approach, there's maybe three things we're interested in: policy innovation, right? Bring some new ideas. We're interested in, this is a doggedly part, good evidence being used in policy development. But the third thing, and maybe the most important one, is trying to ensure that the voices and perspectives of people who would otherwise not be in the policy process are brought to the table. I mean, the deep expertise that exists in communities. John launched us, I think, by saying democracy is about listening, right? And I think good policy is developed when people are listening to Canadians, like really trying to understand what their issues are, right? So when you're, regulating the payday loan industry, for example, and you've listened to the people who are clients of the payday loan industry, you're going to do a better job developing regulation, right? Or private career colleges have a particular clientele, and not all of them are good actors, right? And if you're thinking about regulating that space and you listen to the clientele, you're going to have better public policy. I think it's just better for all Canadians when we have better public policy.
Thanks, Alan. Ecam, I'm going to turn it to you just to talk a little bit about, you've spent a good majority of your career, since I've known you anyways, supporting young people and building their social capital, particularly in racialized communities, urbanized communities, marginalized communities, structurally disadvantaged communities. So who can be engaged in this work, and give us some hope, what's working?
I would say what's working, picking up on what Alan was saying is listening, with intent to do something, and being transparent about when you can't do anything and you're there, to listen, amplify the message, and connect people to others. I think over the time that I've been doing this kind of work, what has worked for me is I've been fortunate to have worked with very good leaders on the teams that I have been. And I say this because it is relevant to our conversation now. I have, in my entire career, I have had a string of phenomenal bosses, and all of them have been women. Most of them have been women of color. And one thing that I have found consistent is how much they invested in lifting up what their teams were feeding back to them as the structural issues, the challenges that were making it difficult for us to do what we wanted to do. So I will say what has been working is placing yourself in that position of listening to what community is saying, hearing, and throwing your resources at the things that you can, making mistakes out loud, learning from them. Relentless measurement evaluation has been something that I've been really, really interested in for much of my career, is figuring out why. I had a teacher who once said that, a lot of people paid the ultimate price for us to figure out which mushrooms are edible and which ones are not. So it is on us to continue to do that kind of, iterative M&E in the programs that we fund, the initiatives, the policy that we champion, and how we put them forward. And when we pull the plug to say, okay, this thing worked amazingly for 10 years, just because it worked then does not mean that we have to continue to do it. The needs might now be different, the population might not be different, and it might have been a thing that was necessary for a time, and it's time to do something new.
I'm going to give each of you just like a minute or two, so we have some time for some audience questions. But maybe I'll start with you, Mohammed. Can you share with us some examples of initiatives and partnerships between civil society organizations and government or philanthropy or any combination of those three sectors that's leaving you hopeful? And as an addendum to that, what is your prognosis for the future health of Canada's democracy as you leave our conference here today?
I was going to talk about something else, but so before I got here a little bit early today, so I texted Alejandro Bravo, who's a city councilor in Davenport. I'm like, hey, I'm here early. What are you doing? Can we hang out? She's like, yeah, come up. I want to show you something. So I go up to the second floor and she's like, that person came from the Tamil Youth Fellowship. That person came from the Black Youth Fellowship. That person came. So we were going walking around different offices. And the reason why she was saying that is because in 2015, her and I had brought together about 50 Muslim youth into a mosque basement. I'm not sure if the mayor was there or not. Americans from the Canadian Muslim Vote. It's a very important organization within the Muslim community. And we brought 50 young folks to talk about what the election of 2015 meant, which was a huge awakening moment within the Muslim community. And they said, we don't feel like we're heard and we don't feel like democracy, we don't see ourselves involved in democracy. So we had a debate, which was like the first big scale Muslim community debate in Toronto at the Al Khan Museum. In response to that, they crafted all the questions. It was a huge moment of inspiration because they felt like the questions that mattered to them were being answered. And then we created this thing called the Muslim Youth Fellowship back in 2017, which was we trained young graduates of university in political operations on how to run campaigns, how do you leaflet, we even took them door knocking, for random causes. And then, but we got them, we got their political muscles moving. And we got 14 of them, we trained them and then we sent them to get paid positions working for city councilors as for internships for 3 months. So then they worked for a city councilor and the mayor for 3 months. We took that Muslim Youth Fellowship and then we converted it into a Black Youth Fellowship and then a Tamil Youth Fellowship. And then the Filipino community was like, hold on. I was like, what about us? So we got to create a Filipino Youth Fellowship. I think they're building a Chinese Youth Fellowship now. So it's just going endlessly perpetuating. But what was amazing is Alejandra was the one who facilitated that conversation for us back in 2015 in the basement of the mosque. And she's like, every single one of the offices has one of these young folks working today, which, back in 2017, when we started this thing, there was about 250 political staffers across all the offices for city council. This is when they had 44 wards and there were less than 25 racialized folks there. And today I ran into Bushra and Bushra was like, yo, there's 16 hijabis here. I don't even know what to do with them. So the environment has changed, but I think that was a partnership between the City of Toronto, the Urban Alliance on Race Relations, and the money for that came from the Atkinson Foundation. They gave us 10 grand, which is nothing in foundation world. It's 10 grand. Go incubate an idea. We're like, okay, we're gonna run with it, and that was it. That's what started it.
And Mohammed, your prognosis for the future health? Do you have a prognosis?
Yo, I'm kind of scared, man. Honestly, I'm looking at what's happening online, and I'm seeing how polarity is pulling people apart. How when you look down south, and you see neighbors and families that are very much viscerally against each other. I feel that's we are at risk for that as well. I think the sense of disinformation and the online space is so polluted right now until we have some circuit breaker moments that start changing our relationship with the internet and creating a sense of civility and regularity in this space. Until that happens, I think we're in a negative trajectory. And my minute is up.
I was very generous with that minute. Alan, can you give us an example or examples that leave you feeling hopeful about the future?
The best thing about my job is I spend every day, all day, talking to people who are amazing and trying to make the world a better place. So my perspective is colored by that. I could, if we had time, probably 300 or 400 examples, but we don't have time. So trust me. We're not supposed to say trust me. There are thousands and thousands and thousands of Canadians out there spending their days trying to make the country better. I'll give you just one concrete example though, because it's fresh in my mind. In the province of Alberta, there's a network of about 50 organizations who serve people that are recovering from intimate partner violence. They got together with senior public servants in justice, in health, in community and social services, with police forces in the major cities in the province, and with a couple of university researchers. And they spent 2 years and they developed a public policy framework for the province that's focused on prevention of intimate partner violence, right? Huge impact. And there are many examples like that. I could go on. So my prognosis is based on my perspective because I get to see this stuff happening. You know, I mean, we're a extremely diverse country, enormous geographically. We got a few really big cities, a lot of kind of big cities, but lots and lots and lots of small population centers flung across the country, incredible diversity through the piece. And that's just going to increase as time goes on. If you think about who's coming to Canada to claim this as their country, you know, that's going to present some challenges in terms of democracy, the health of our democracy. But I'm really optimistic. I mean, just look around the room. Look who's been in the room for the last couple of days.
Ekem, last word to you. I recognize the very large stick is about to pull us all off the stage. So last word to Ekem, and then John will let me know if we have time for one or two. No questions. Great. Okay, moving on.
Okay, I'll be quick. There's a number of programs that we fund through my work. One of them that comes to mind right now is an organization called La Converse. They work in Montreal. We funded them to develop a program. What they do is journalism training for racialized journalists, particularly women of color, training them on how you do journalism excuse me, with an anti-racism and an anti-oppressive lens, and how you navigate the career and the industry of journalism, learning how to tell stories and collect stories and edit stories from that perspective. It dovetails into one of our larger programs, Forum for Young Canadians, which is essentially a training ground for young people to participate in civic engagement and democratic institution behavior. We're trying to put those two together as much as we can and see how far we can push. For Forum for Young Canadians is a 45-year-old program. You can imagine what that looked like over 45 years and what it can look like in the next 45. My prognosis, it's getting better, but it's not going to just keep getting better on its own. We have a lot to do actively to make sure that it continues to go in that direction.
Well, I think on that hopeful, but I think important and constructive note, I want to give a big warm thank you to Alan, Mohammed, and Ekem for being our closing panel this afternoon. Thank you all so much.